The gun was already raised when Bumpy Johnson stopped it with a look, choosing mercy in front of witnesses who expected blood. Because sometimes, letting a man live delivers a far deadlier warning. Nobody moved when the insult landed. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. One careless sentence slid across the room and scraped against Bumpy Johnson's name like a blade testing skin. Hands tightened. The chairs shifted. The air knew what came next. The man stood there smiling too long, mistaking silence for permission. He had talked himself into courage, or maybe desperation. Either way, he believed the moment belonged to him now. In Harlem, that belief killed men. Bumpy didn't raise his voice. He didn't rise from his chair. He let the room feel the weight of what had been said. Every eye checked him first, not the offender. That was the order. That was the law. A gun came up behind the man. Then another, fast, clean, expected. Bumpy lifted one hand. It wasn't a command, it was a reminder. The room froze in mid-breath. Even the man sensed something had changed, though he didn't yet understand what mercy felt like when it brushed past death. Bumpy finally stood, slow, deliberate. His face showed nothing. No anger, no insult taken. That was worse. "You don't know where you're standing," Bumpy said quietly enough that the words had to lean forward to be heard. The man swallowed. The smile left him. Bumpy stepped close enough to make the threat personal without touching him. "Today," Bumpy said, "you're going to walk out." A pause followed. Not relief. Fear. "Because I need you alive," he finished. That was when everyone understood. Someone living was about to carry something far heavier than a body. Harlem listened, learning power could whisper and still rule. Harlem didn't need announcements. It shifts the way a body feels weather. By morning, people knew something had happened, not details, just the shape of it. A ripple where there should have been blood. Bumpy Johnson walked his streets like he always did. No entourage pressing forward, no show of force, just presence. Shop owners nodded without stopping their work. Men on corners straightened their backs, not out of fear but alignment. Harlem moved when Bumpy moved, because order followed him naturally. Power didn't live in his hands, it lived in restraint. He passed the barber shop where conversations lowered on instinct. He passed the numbers of runners who kept their eyes respectful, knowing they were protected because they behaved. Harlem understood the arrangement. Loyalty earned safety. Disrespect earned silence, or worse. The men who had been in the room the night before said little. They didn't need to. Each of them replayed the same moment. The raised gun, the lifted hand, the choice not taken. They understood the message wasn't for them. It was for the city. Bumpy sat later that day, listening, more than speaking. A man brought him coffee. Another brought news, carefully filtered. No one asked why the man was spared. That question belonged to people who didn't understand the consequences. Bumpy understood that violence was easy. Anyone could pull a trigger. But restraint required authority so absolute it didn't need proving. Outside, the spared man walked Harlem like a ghost. People noticed. They always noticed. A man who should have been gone was still breathing. That unsettled things. Questions formed but stayed unspoken. Bumpy knew exactly how long to let that discomfort live. He believed in community not as softness but structure. Harlem was his responsibility, not his possession. Order wasn't maintained through fear alone. Fear faded, memory didn't. He had learned long ago that every action echoed longer than a gunshot. A dead man vanished. A living one talked. I walked, carried stories into rooms Bumpy didn't need to enter himself. That was the balance. That was leadership. As night settled, the city adjusted around the absence of violence. And in that quiet, something heavier settled in its place: understanding. Harlem knew who held the weight, and more importantly, why he didn't always drop it. The man had spent his life confusing noise for strength. In places where shouting kept you alive, he had learned to push, to poke, to see who flinched first. Harlem, to him, was just another room full of men pretending to be larger than they were. That was his mistake. He had heard Bumpy Johnson's name long before he spoke it wrong, heard it whispered, not celebrated. I heard it followed by silence. But distance makes legends feel negotiable. He believed reputation dulled with time. He believed power demanded constant proof. So he tested it. The insult wasn't accidental. It was measured, small enough to retreat from if needed, large enough to be noticed. He wanted to see how Bumpy would respond, wanted to know if the stories still held weight. What he hadn't accounted for was the room itself. When Bumpy lifted his hand, the man felt something colder than fear. He felt exclusion. The guns weren't for him anymore. The moment wasn't his. He had stepped into a structure older than his nerve, and it didn't react the way he expected. Walking out alive didn't feel like victory. It felt like a delay. Every step afterward stretched time. Men looked at him longer than necessary. Conversations stopped when he entered, not hostile, observant. Harlem was watching him now, the way it watched storms approach. He replayed Bumpy's words again and again. I need you alive. Not forgiveness, not mercy. Purpose. That purpose weighed on him. He understood now that Bumpy hadn't spared him for kindness. He had been turned into a vessel. The man tried to leave Harlem. That failed. Doors closed gently but completely. He tried to explain himself. Nobody asked for explanations. They already knew the ending hadn't arrived yet. At night, he imagined footsteps behind him, not attackers, messengers. He slept lightly, waking to his own breath. He understood that death would have been simpler. Bumpy didn't contact him, didn't rush the next move. That silence was intentional. Pressure grows best when left alone. The man finally understood his role. He wasn't being hunted. He was being positioned. He had tested a boundary expecting violence. What he received instead was responsibility, and responsibility, once given, could not be returned. Disrespect, when done privately, could sometimes be corrected quietly. When done in public, it demanded memory. It happened in the open, where Harlem's eyes were already trained. A place meant for conversation, not confrontation. The men arrived again, fewer this time, but louder. They chose visibility on purpose. They wanted witnesses. They wanted to turn restraint into weakness. They spoke his name without care, not as a warning, now, but as a challenge. They leaned where they should have stood straight. They laughed where silence had always been currency. Every move was intentional, designed to redraw lines that had been settled long ago. Bumpy Johnson was not present. That was part of the insult. Word traveled fast, carried not by messengers but by offense. Storefronts closed early, music dimmed. People did not scatter. They stayed. Communities stay when they expect judgment, not chaos. By the time Bumpy arrived, the noise had already thinned. Not because the men stopped talking, but because no one answered them anymore. Harlem had withdrawn its attention. That withdrawal was heavier than anger. Bumpy entered without announcement. The chairs shifted, breaths adjusted. The men noticed too late. They straightened instinctively, like boys remembering discipline they thought they'd outgrown. He did not address them immediately. He acknowledged the room first. Eyes met him. Small nods passed. A network reaffirmed itself without a word spoken. Then he turned to the men. They tried to speak first. They always did at this stage. Talking was how they convinced themselves they still had control. They mentioned names, numbers, consequences that would come if compliance did not. Bumpy let them finish. Let the silence stretch afterward until their words collapsed under their own weight. Public disrespect had rules. Once committed, it could not be erased, only answered. He reminded them calmly where they stood, not geographically, historically. Harlem had not been claimed by noise or threats. It had been built through understanding, protected by patience, enforced only when necessary. They laughed again, softer this time. Laughter meant to save face. Laughter meant for each other, not him. That was when Bumpy's voice lowered. He did not threaten. Threats were for men unsure of outcome. He explained consequence the way one explains gravity. Not personal, not emotional, simply unavoidable. The room absorbed it. Harlem listened. Outsiders rarely did. One of the men made a final mistake, a step forward, a word said too quickly. Disrespect doubled down, hoping momentum could replace wisdom. Bumpy stood then, slowly, purposefully. No one blocked him. No one spoke. The correction did not happen there. That mattered. Public disrespect deserved private resolution, but public memory. The men were allowed to leave, allowed to believe they still had agency. Harlem knew better. By morning, everyone understood the line had been crossed beyond repair. What came next would not be loud. It would not be immediate. But it would be precise enough to echo longer than gunfire. Bumpy Johnson did not rush correction. He allowed anticipation to do half the work. Fear grows best in silence, and silence was something Harlem obeyed without instruction. Bumpy didn't raise his voice. He never did when it mattered most. The man stood across from him, hands at his sides, spine stiff with the effort of staying upright. The crowd wasn't close, but it was present. That was enough. Harlem didn't need front row seats. It needed awareness. Bumpy spoke as if they were alone. You thought noise made you real, he said, not accusing, observing. You thought if you said my name out loud, it would shrink. The man's eyes stayed forward. He didn't deny it. Denial would have insulted them both. Bumpy took one step closer. Not threatening. Final. I let you walk because your body doesn't talk, he continued. But a man who lives with shame, he teaches every day. The man swallowed. His breath was the only sound anyone could hear. You're going to tell them, Bumpy said. Not with words. With how you move. With how quiet you get. With how careful you become. He paused, letting the instructions settle into something permanent. Every room you enter will remember this moment, Bumpy finished. And every man who sees you will learn what happens when respect slips. The man nodded once. Slow, heavy. That nod carried more agreement than any promise. Bumpy stepped back. That was the end of it. No blood spilled. No hands raised. The lesson was complete. The crowd didn't react. That was the mark of understanding. Excitement belonged to chaos. Calm belonged to order. Harlem absorbed what it had witnessed and stored it where memory lived longest. The man walked away, not hurried, not escorted. His punishment moved with him now. Every glance would remind him. Every silence would repeat the message. Bumpy remained where he was for a moment longer. He didn't watch the man leave. He watched Harlem breathe again. Violence could end a problem. control could end a question. That day, Bumpy Johnson answered one without creating the other. The city learned something rare. Power didn't always announce itself with death. Sometimes it spoke once quietly and let a living man carry the echo forever. The man lived. That was the part people remembered first, not because it was generous, but because it was deliberate. Harlem had seen death often enough to know when it was being withheld on purpose. The man didn't disappear. He didn't rise either. He became something else entirely. A quiet presence, a moving marker. Wherever he went, the story went with him, stripped of drama, heavy with meaning. Nobody asked him what happened. They already knew the outline. All they needed was to see how carefully he walked now. He avoided corners, avoided rooms where voices grew sharp. He learned how to sit without being noticed, how to listen without reacting. Harlem watched this transformation with interest, not pity. Pity weakened lessons. This one strengthened them. Bumpy Johnson never mentioned the man again. That silence was intentional. Legacy didn't require repetition. It required consistency. Bumpy continued as he always had, settling disputes before they rotted, protecting the people who stayed within the rules, correcting those who didn't. The city understood now that correction didn't always come as punishment. Sometimes it came as an instruction. Young men noticed. That mattered most. They had grown up believing power meant immediacy, reaction, proving something in front of witnesses. But what they saw instead was patience shaping outcomes. They saw that Bumpy didn't need fear to maintain order. He used understanding, timing, and memory. Harlem respected that. The streets grew steadier, not quieter, just steadier. Disputes softened before they hardened. Words were chosen more carefully. Names were spoken with consideration, not because everyone was afraid, but because everyone understood the structure they lived inside. Bumpy had reinforced it without tearing it down. Years later, people would argue about what made him dangerous. Some would say it was his reputation. Others would say it was his intelligence. But those who had been there knew the truth. His power came from what he didn't do. He didn't rush. He didn't explain himself. He didn't need approval. He believed in community as inheritance. What you left behind mattered more than what you took. Harlem wasn't a battlefield to him. It was a responsibility, one that demanded restraint as much as force. The man who lived became a footnote, but an effective one. A reminder that Bumpy Johnson didn't just rule through consequence, he ruled through foresight. When people spoke of him later, they didn't speak of cruelty. They spoke of inevitability, of how things seemed to fall into place around him, whether they wanted to or not, of how chaos lost interest in places where control was patient. That day, no one died. And because of that, the lesson lasted longer. Harlem learned that respect wasn't enforced through constant violence. It was enforced through memory, through the understanding that some men didn't need to kill you to end you. They could simply redefine who you were allowed to be afterward. Bumpy Johnson left Harlem that message, and Harlem, loyal to structure, never forgot it.